All right, so we're going to continue talking about some of the early texts and early apostolic fathers from the 2nd century or the 100s. The two that I want to talk about in this lecture are titled the Didache, or the 12, or the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, and the Epistle of Barnabas. Now, EP is obviously shortened for epistle. That just means letter, the Epistle of Barnabas. Let's talk about the Didache first. So again, these are very early texts written in the early 100s. This one is particularly interesting because lots of early Christians ended up using it. Now, if you haven't heard of it, it's because it's not in our New Testament, but lots of early Christians read it and thought it was very important. So as I mentioned, the Didache means 12. It's a Greek word. The text also has the title, The Teaching of the 12 Apostles. What I've given you here are two sections from the Didache. And again, what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and read these. And before you do that, I'll just point out that I'm using chapter 1 and chapter 5. And these are called the two ways, the one of life and one of death. And I will also put a tag up here so that if you're interested, you can read the entire Didache. So why don't you stop the video and read through this. Okay, so what this text is really doing is it's teaching Christians how to behave, early Christians how to behave. The first one is called the way of life, and it goes through and tells you how to act. So love the God who made you, love your neighbor as yourself, and then this very famous phrase, do not do to another what you do not wish done to yourself. There are 3 more chapters, then when you get to chapter 5, this is the way of death, which of course is just the opposite. And this is telling Christians how not to act. So I'm not going to read this entire thing, but don't kill anybody, don't practice adultery, no false testimony, and so on. When you read through the Didache, what you'll find are certainly a number of ideas. And what I've done is I've broken it down into what I've called the key ideas. And again, these texts are extremely important for not only learning about what early Christians were doing, but it's how they behave and what they were doing within their own practice of the religion. So what you find in the Didache is that there are instructions on baptism, and this is a pretty early description of that. What baptism was for these early Christians reading the Didache was it was either full immersion or pouring water on your head 3 times. And then you were considered to be baptized. It told Christians to recite the Lord's Prayer daily, and you can find that in your Bible. It also talks about the Eucharist, or the taking of the wafer and the wine. This was an early forerunner to what the Catholic Church will do and some of the Protestant churches will do today. And then you can also find this really interesting section on confessions of sin in church. And this is in chapter 4, section 14. In terms of ecclesiology, so we've talked about this is the structure of the early church. You get the mention of these 3 higher offices in the church that we talked about before. The prophet, the apostle, and the teacher. So remember we talked about those, and these come directly out of the early writings of the New Testament. Now what's really interesting about the Didache is that there's no indication of only one bishop in a city. You do find a bishop mentioned. The title is episkopos, and we talked about that Greek word before. There's also mention of the deacons, or diakonoi, and this is in chapter 15. The Didache makes it clear that these 2 groups should be chosen from the local population and not brought in. And it also talks about, in terms of hierarchy, the bishop is lower than the prophet or the teacher. So again, you've got these various offices that will soon become obsolete, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. I've given you here some text from chapter 11 of the Didache, and what it is, it's regarding these teachers, apostles, and prophets. And if you remember the lecture on the New Testament ecclesiology, where I was talking about how we have these descriptions in the New Testament of these 3 offices, but not really very much about what they did other than the apostles. So what the Didache is doing is it's talking a little bit more about what these people are doing in these particular roles. So why don't you stop the video, read through this, and then I'll talk about it in just a little bit. Okay, so what you're finding in chapter 11 is that these people are traveling. So welcome anyone who comes into your community. If a teacher is teaching something that's not correct, pay no attention to them. If the teaching is in line with text from the New Testament or what other Christians are saying, welcome that person. Now, in terms of the apostles and the prophets, these people need to act like how they're described in the New Testament. And again, welcome every apostle who comes into your community, but there are rules. And what you see here is they can't stay beyond 1 day. If it's absolutely necessary, they can stay for 2. But you can see here, if they stay for 3, then these people are not real. So they're fake. And so you kick these prophets out. Now, I had mentioned when we talked about these offices before that there is a push, especially in the 100s, to get rid of some of these people, because what they're doing is they're coming into all these communities and causing problems. So early Christians start forming these rules. And then you can see when an apostle is there and getting ready to leave, he shouldn't ask for money. If he does, he's a false prophet. You can give him money to carry until the next lodging. So really just give him, you give him food to carry to the next lodging, and just enough for 1 day. If he asks for money, he's fake. And then again, this continues into the later parts of chapter 11. You've got what a prophet should be doing. And here they're talking about making ecstatic utterances. You shouldn't test this person. However, this person who's doing it must act like Jesus. And if their conduct is different, then they're a false prophet. This is also talking about how these prophets can only stay for a very short time in your community. However, they can stay. So again, what you should probably do is turn off the video and read through this section. So what you can see is if a prophet comes in, they can certainly stay if they have work that they can do, if they can make their own living. If they don't, then you have to figure out as a group whether this person should stay with you as a Christian. If he refuses to do this, as you can see, he's trading on Christ. And you have to be careful of people who are like this. So again, these are rules to make sure that these people are not causing more difficulties. And then, of course, you get the section on what the bishops and deacons are. So elect these people, and this is what they should really be like. They have to be in line with the teachings, and if not, really get rid of them. They're fake again, just like these false prophets and false apostles that the Didache just talked about. In terms of eschatology or the end times, you certainly get this. I didn't mention this in terms of early eschatology, but Paul, in some of his early writings, talk about how the end is near. Now, of course, the end was not near during the time of Paul, and if you look at his later writings, he starts moving away from that idea. In the Didache, you've got this idea that the end is coming soon. There will be a deceiver, and this is a fairly common idea in early Christianity as well as in modern Christianity. You can see people talking about this. It's a sign that the end will be near. Now, the writer of the Didache knew that Paul was excited about the end, and then he became disappointed when it didn't happen. So even though it's saying the end is coming soon, it's telling people don't get excited about this. So it'll happen when it happens. And then, just as I talked about before, we can find later sources. So I've talked about Eusebius, who wrote in the early 300s. He also mentions the teaching of the apostles. So this is a work that you could read in church if you wanted to. And I haven't really talked about this, the Apocalypse of John, which is Revelation. There was still some people deciding whether that was actually a work that Christians could read or not. But anyway, the teaching of the 12 apostles was mentioned by Eusebius. Athanasius, who we talked about before, in his list of texts that people could read, also talks about the teaching of the 12. And again, what he says here is that people who can read these works, who wish for instruction in the word of godliness, but they're not within the same category, the same canon as the New Testament. Okay, let's just talk really briefly about the next work, and this is called the Epistle or the Letter of Barnabas. This was probably not written by Barnabas himself, and Barnabas was mentioned in the New Testament. He's one of Paul's friends. He has sort of a falling out with Paul because they were disagreeing, but this is a letter that was supposedly written by him. It's a really interesting letter for the study of early Christianity because it talks a little bit about Christology, or the study of Christ. So what you see in the Epistle of Barnabas is that Christ has always been in existence. And, you know, this idea is not a new one, but he talks about it. Christ suffered for the sins of others. What I find most interesting about the Epistle of Barnabas, and again, I will put a tag up, so if you want to read this text, you can read it. There are quite a few what I call secret messages revealed. So early Christians loved to pick up these texts from the New and Old Testament and sort of read between the lines and get all these other information out. So this is one section. And what I would like you to do before I even start talking about it is to stop the video and read through this. And what I've got here is a bit of the Old Testament. So go ahead and stop this and read the entire thing. Okay, and I just mentioned in the last slide that early Christians like to look at these texts and find secret messages. So here you've got a passage from the Old Testament. Abraham circumcised 10 and 8 and 300 men of his household. Now, the author of the Epistle of Barnabas is wondering what these mean, and he's going to tell you. The 10 and the 8 are denoted by an I and an H. And what he's saying is this is really meaning Jesus. So 10 and 8 here equals Jesus. And he also says that the next letter, the important letter, is a T, which comes from 300. And for the writer of the Epistle of Barnabas, this is the cross. So this is the expression of the cross. So what the author is saying, and you can read this here, is that what this really means is it's signifying that Jesus by the 2 letters and cross by the other one. So even though this text seems pretty simple, where it's talking about Abraham is circumcising these people, some early Christians, like the author of Barnabas, said, wait, there's a secret message in here, or a message that for them seemed clear once you knew what it was. And for them, it was talking about Jesus. There's also some really interesting things that were wrong, like scientifically, where there are passages in the Old Testament that were confusing, so they tried to explain them. And you find a passage in the Old Testament, you shall not eat the hyena. And for Barnabas, he's saying what this really means is you shall not be an adulterer or corrupter, nor be like them. And he's saying, why is this connected? It's because the hyena changes its sex annually. And at one time it's male, and at another time it's female. Now, some of these are obviously pretty crazy for us today, but for some early Christians, this is the way that they ended up reading some of these texts. And again, this is another example. So what I want you to do is to stop the video and to read through this. Okay, and what you've seen is I've given you a fairly large chunk of chapter 11, which is a part of the Psalms. So Psalms 1, 3 to 6, which talks about a tree, it yields fruit when it's supposed to, and so on. And for Barnabas, he says this is describing baptism, which is the water, and the cross of Jesus. So now, usually whenever early Christians found a mention of a tree in the Old Testament, for them, lights went on and said that automatically means the cross that Jesus was crucified on. And whenever they read about water, they always seem to signify that this meant baptism and the cross. Okay, and then this is the last slide I have for the Epistle of Barnabas. This is another example again where the author has found a source and is trying to explain it. Now what's really interesting about this is that we don't know where this particular source is coming from. And what he's doing is he's found some text that says it's from the Old Testament, and it's giving a quote from the Lord: "When a tree shall be bent down and again arise, and when blood shall flow out of the wood." So we don't know where that's coming from, but for the author of Barnabas, this is signifying the cross again, and Jesus who should be crucified. So early Christians like to look at these texts, especially from the Old Testament, and try and find statements or indications that Jesus was talked about in these texts.